News of the Times, the Harvard murder, the disappearance of Dr. Parkman, true crime from 1849. Today, we begin in the crisp winter light of 1849 Boston, a world Victorian in its manners, even if it's not in its geography. And it is here, within the quiet academic halls of Harvard, that a most unsettling mystery begins to take shape. Dr. George Parkman was a man of strict habits. He ate at the same hour each day, he walked the same route, and he kept a relentless account of every shilling owed to him. So when he failed to return home for dinner, even by a minute, his family knew at once that something was profoundly wrong. Witnesses have seen him hurrying toward the Harvard Medical College, and then, quite suddenly, he vanished. As the city searched and rumours swirled, attention drifted inevitably back to the medical school, to locked doors, unusual fires, and the one man who claimed to have seen Dr. Parkman alive that afternoon, Professor John Webster. What follows is a case that unsettled Boston, strained the reputation of Harvard, and forced the courts to confront questions of science, identification, and truth in a way they had never done before. This is the disappearance and the murder that would come to be remembered as the Harvard mystery. And do stay with us to the end, where in further particulars we look at a small but wonderfully Victorian morsel from the newspapers, a breathless report of a supposed royal scandal involving a prince, a determined father, Parliament, and a marriage that Queen Victoria was adamant would not take place. It is a reminder that while the Victorians excelled in science and industry, they devoted just as much energy to elaborate gossip. So, settle yourself somewhere comfortable, perhaps with a warm drink to hand, and prepare to be transported back nearly 180 years to a world where forensic science was in its infancy and only just beginning, quite literally, to show its teeth. From H.B. Irving's A Book of Remarkable Criminals. In 1849, Harvard University was a place of immense social weight. Far less the modern research giant we know today, and far more an elite New England institution shaped by centuries of tradition. Its professors were expected to embody refinement, stability, and scholarly dignity, maintaining households and habits that reflected their position in society. Yet, behind the grandeur, the reality could be far less secure. Academic salaries were modest, often precariously so, and reputation was a kind of currency. To fall into debt, especially to another gentleman of standing, was not merely a private embarrassment. It threatened one's social respectability, one's livelihood, and the delicate hierarchy of privilege that Harvard itself represented. In this world of rigid expectations, personal honour and financial reliability were not abstract virtues, but essential pillars of identity. And it is within this environment of intellectual prestige and private pressure that the events of today's case unfold. He was a man who was never late, not once, not ever. And so when Dr. George Parkman failed to return home for his usual 2:30 dinner in the winter of 1849, the city of Boston felt a sudden tightening in its chest, a subtle but unmistakable sense that something had gone badly wrong. His last confirmed sighting placed him striding toward the Harvard medical buildings, a paper bag of groceries still waiting for him at a shop he intended to revisit, and then nothing. No footsteps, no letters, no hint of a journey taken or a message delayed. Just silence, settling over the academic halls like a winter frost. A disappearance that made no sense, and one that would lead investigators deep into the locked rooms and troubled secrets of Harvard itself. It is 1849 in Boston, a world Victorian in temperament, even if not in geography. Along the banks of the Charles River sits Harvard Medical School, a sombre red brick presence, its lecture rooms and laboratories standing in quiet contrast to the relentless, restless city around it. At the centre of our story are two men whose lives had once run in parallel. Dr George Parkman, a fiercely punctual, rigid in his habits, and relentless in matters of money, and Professor John Webster, genial, respected, outwardly composed, yet financially spiralling beneath the surface. Their long acquaintance was strained by debts, fraying trust, and the uncomfortable weight of reputation in a society where a Harvard professor was expected to embody stability above all else. And when Dr. Parkman vanished, it was towards this building and towards these two men that all attention soon turned. What followed would unsettle Boston, challenge Harvard's dignity, and lead the courts into scientific territory they had never trodden before, a case in which identification itself would become the battleground. This is the Harvard mystery and the investigation that would make forensic history. Parkman and Webster. Dr. George Parkman and Professor John Webster had known one another for decades. They entered Harvard in the same year. They rose through Boston society together, and for a time they considered each other friends. But friendship can erode quietly when money begins to flow in only one direction. Parkman was a man easily recognized in the streets of Boston. Tall, sharp-featured, impatient in his manner, he was known for rigid routines, brisk speech, and an uncompromising sense of financial propriety. When owed money, he expected repayment. When lied to, he did not forget. And when he believed himself deceived, he pursued the matter with an energy bordering on obsession. Webster, by contrast, was mild in temperament, warm in company, and widely liked. But beneath that geniality lay a chronic weakness. Money slipped through his fingers. He lived above his means, collected expensive minerals, entertained lavishly, and reassured creditors with charm rather than payment. His financial situation grew so precarious that, in desperation, he mortgaged his prized mineral collection and then, astonishingly, mortgaged the very same collection a second time to another creditor. When Parkman learned of this double pledge, something in him hardened. What he saw was not misfortune but deceit, and from that moment his pursuit of Webster became relentless. He confronted him at his home. He confronted him at Harvard, and he sat in the front row of Webster's lectures, staring at him as he tried to teach. He spoke openly of taking legal action, and he made it clear that he would not be satisfied until the debt was settled, publicly if necessary. The pressure on Webster, already struggling, became suffocating. To owe money was embarrassing enough. To owe it to a man like Parkman, who was not only a creditor but a prominent figure in Boston society, was a humiliation. To be exposed by him would mean ruin. It is here, in this tightening vice of debt, arrogance, fear, and pride, that the events of the 23rd of November 1849 begin to take shape. The last day, Friday the 23rd of November 1849, began like any other in the life of George Parkman, a man governed by punctuality as if it were a moral virtue. Shortly after 1:30, he was seen in a grocer's shop on Bridge Street, purchasing a few small items and leaving behind a paper bag containing a single lettuce. He told the shopkeeper he would collect it on his way home. At roughly 1:45, a workman spotted Parkman striding toward the Harvard Medical College, the direction of his scheduled appointment with Professor John Webster. And then the pattern ruptures. 2:30 came and went, but Parkman did not appear at his dinner table, an absence so unthinkable that his family felt immediate fear. He had never once failed to keep this routine. As shadows lengthened and no message arrived, anxiety hardened into alarm. By evening, his family and close friends were searching the city. By nightfall, it was clear something was very wrong. Dr. Parkman had vanished without a trace, leaving behind a dinner uneaten, a paper bag uncollected, and a trail that ended at the doors of Harvard Medical School. Inside Harvard, the locked rooms. If the disappearance of Dr. Parkman unsettled Boston, the behavior inside Harvard's Medical College in the days that followed unsettled at least one man far more directly. Ephraim Littlefield, the building's janitor, knew every corridor, furnace room, and hidden recess of the place. It was his duty to keep the fires burning, fetch water, clean the lecture theatres, and ensure that nothing at the medical school surprised him. But that week, everything surprised him. First came the locked doors. Rooms that were usually open, especially Professor Webster's lecture lab, were now kept fastened at all hours. Littlefield found he could no longer enter to perform his duties. Webster, normally polite, had become abrupt, guarding the key with an intensity that bordered on paranoia. Then came the water. Littlefield heard it running continuously behind Webster's door for hours at a time. Buckets being emptied, sinks flushed, a strange rhythmic splashing as if something heavy was being washed again and again, and always the heat. Webster kept an unusually fierce fire blazing in the laboratory furnace. Littlefield noticed it even from the corridor, the door plates hot to the touch, the air thick, the odour metallic. This was not the behaviour of a man conducting routine chemical experiments, and it was certainly not the behaviour of the mild, amiable professor Littlefield thought he knew. Most disturbing of all was Webster's presence. He stayed late, far later than was his habit, pacing, locking and relocking doors, refusing access to anyone. He even snapped at Littlefield for attempting to enter a room he had always maintained. And with each passing day, the janitor's unease grew. He began to fear something dreadful had occurred, not only because the signs pointed toward it, but because if suspicion fell upon the medical school, he knew exactly who would be blamed first. A janitor had little power, little money, and few advocates. If something terrible had happened inside those locked rooms, Littlefield realized with a cold certainty that he might easily become the convenient scapegoat. And so, the man who feared being accused decided he must become the investigator. The search for Parkman. By the following day, Dr. Parkman's disappearance had become more than a family worry. It had become a matter of public agitation. Handbills were printed and distributed at remarkable speed. They appeared on shop fronts, on street corners, at the ferry landings, and along the paths leading to Harvard. A reward was offered, and Bostonians ever attentive to the movements of a man as conspicuous as Parkman began sending in reports from all directions. Yet, as the police sifted through the accounts, a pattern emerged. The sightings dwindled the moment Parkman was observed walking towards the medical college. Beyond that point, the trail dissolved entirely. Meanwhile, Professor John Webster found himself answering uncomfortable questions and answering them rather poorly. He stated that Parkman had called on him, that he had paid him the outstanding debt, and that Parkman had then and there destroyed the promissory note. It was a straightforward explanation, but it carried an air of convenience that did little to settle anyone's mind. Moreover, Webster's recounting of the hour, the exact sequence of events, and even the tone of the meeting altered slightly with each retelling. None of this amounted to proof of wrongdoing, but it quietly eroded confidence in his account. In a city already uneasy, these small discrepancies began to feel significant. The disappearance of Dr. Parkman was no longer an isolated puzzle. It was becoming a matter that touched Harvard itself, and the suspicion that something serious had occurred was gathering weight. Littlefield's investigation. If the official search for Dr. Parkman was wide, the unofficial one, conducted by Ephraim Littlefield, was far more precise. In the days following this disappearance, Littlefield found himself replaying several small troubling encounters. Earlier that week, Professor Webster had asked with unusual urgency whether anyone had been near the dissecting room vault. The question had been abrupt, almost furtive, and entirely unlike Webster's normal manner. Then there was the wall. Running his hand along the bricks that separated Webster's laboratory from the neighbouring passage, Littlefield felt an extraordinary heat radiating through the stone, far greater than any furnace work ordinarily produced. It was the kind of heat that suggested the fire within had been kept stoked for hours, and the lavatory, a small room adjoining Webster's laboratory, ordinarily unlocked, was now kept firmly closed. The key had vanished. Littlefield's attempts to gain entry were met with curt refusals, something he could not recall ever happening before. These were not definitive clues, merely discomforts, but Littlefield, increasingly fearful that suspicion might fall upon him simply by virtue of proximity, became determined to know what lay behind the professor's unusual behaviour. Thanksgiving Day provided him the opportunity. With the college largely empty and the passages quiet, Littlefield fetched his tools and made his way to the basement. If Webster meant to keep him out of the laboratory, then Littlefield would approach from the other side. He began to chip away at the wall, slowly at first, listening constantly for the sound of footsteps. The mortar was old, the brickwork brittle, and after several hours of work, a crack appeared. Then, as he widened the opening, a faint draught of warm air escaped. Littlefield pressed his eye to the gap. What he saw, dimly illuminated within, stopped him cold, and the unmistakable curve of a human pelvis and the outline of limbs resting in the vaults below. For a long moment he simply stared, scarcely able to draw breath. Whatever had happened to Dr. Parkman, the answer now lay inside the very room Professor Webster had been so determined to keep locked. The mystery had become something far darker. The arrest. When the police finally moved to arrest Professor Webster, they chose to do so with a degree of tact befitting a Harvard gentleman. They called at his home in Cambridge, politely informing him that they required his presence at the medical college to clarify certain matters. Webster, although visibly strained, agreed at once. He donned his coat, reassured his family, and stepped into the carriage with the officers, fully believing that he would soon return. But as the carriage crossed the bridge and turned away from the familiar route to Harvard, something in Webster's expression changed. The streets no longer led toward the college. Instead, they would wound towards the high walls and high gates of Leverett Street jail. When the carriage stopped before the prison entrance, Webster's composure collapsed entirely. He understood in that instant that he was not being consulted. He was being arrested. The professor's panic was immediate and overwhelming. His breathing grew rapidly, his hands shook violently, and officers reported that he pleaded, incoherent at first, then desperately, insisting that he could explain everything if only they would not take him inside. As they escorted him through the doorway, he made a sudden movement towards his coat. An officer seized his arm, and in the struggle a small packet fell to the floor. Inside was strychnine. Webster had attempted to swallow it, a final, frantic effort to avoid the humiliation now engulfing him. The poison had begun to take its effect, his muscles twitching, his face drawn, perspiration gathering along his brow, the officers describing him as trembling, exhausted, and on the verge of collapse. And there was one more detail, damning in its quiet simplicity. Among the items removed from his pockets was a single key, the missing key to the locked lavatory beside his laboratory. It was, in its way, as incriminating as the discovery in the vault, a small object easily overlooked, yet impossible to explain away. The arrest of Professor John Webster marked the moment the case shifted irrevocably from a troubling disappearance to a murder that gripped not only Boston, but the wider world. The forensic breakthrough. Once the vault had yielded its dreadful contents, the work of identification began, and it proved far from straightforward. What little Field had uncovered were incomplete remains, the portions of a torso recovered from the furnace, fragments of limbs concealed within a tea chest, and bones discovered in the lavatory vault. The dispersal alone suggested deliberate effort, and yet, for all the labour taken to obscure the body, one essential question remained unanswered. Could these remains be conclusively proven to belong to George Parkman? In 1849, without fingerprints, DNA, or modern pathology, the task might easily have been insurmountable. But fate and Parkman's dentistry intervened. Among the recovered fragments were several teeth and portions of a jaw containing the remnants of false dentures. Parkman had been fitted for these precisely 3 years earlier by a respected Boston dentist, Dr. Nathan Cooley Keep. Crucially, Dr. Keep had retained the original plaster cast of Parkman's mouth, an exact impression of his dental structure, preserved in his surgery for future reference. In court, Dr. Keep placed the fractured dental pieces recovered from the remains against the cast he made in 1846. They matched perfectly. Every ridge, every contour, every irregularity aligned. It was a moment of extraordinary importance. The judges, jurors, and the assembled public understood at once that this was not mere resemblance, it was scientific identity. In an era when many still distrusted anything that smacked of new methods, the precision of the dental evidence proved decisive. Its legal significance cannot be overstated. It became the first major criminal conviction in the United States based on dental identification. Without the dentures, the prosecution would have struggled to prove the remains were Parkman's at all, and in doing so, the case established forensic dentistry as a legitimate and reliable tool in criminal investigation, a principle that would echo through future decades of forensic science. What had begun with the disappearance was now anchored by one of the earliest examples of scientific certainty in a murder trial. Trial and confession. When Professor John Webster stood trial in March 1850, the proceedings were followed with an intensity unusually reserved for great political events. Boston society packed the galleries, newspapers printed every gesture, every whisper. The evidence, particularly the dental identification, had struck the public with unusual force, and Webster entered the courtroom under a cloud he could not dispel. His legal team urged restraint. They advised him not to speak. But Webster, worn down by fear and sleeplessness, believed he could sway the jury by appealing to their sympathies. It proved a grave misjudgment. When he rose to address them, his statement was rambling, uncertain, and contradictory. He denied premeditation, hinted at provocation, and tried, unsuccessfully, to cast portions of blame upon circumstance rather than himself. Instead of clarity, he produced confusion. Instead of sympathy, unease. It did nothing to help him. Not long after the guilty verdict was returned, Webster made a fuller private confession to the Reverend Dr. Putnam. In this account, he insisted that he had not intended murder. He described a sudden quarrel in the laboratory, Parkman's temper flaring, his own panic rising, and an impulsive blow that proved fatal. The killing, he said, was born of fear and desperation rather than design. But this version never entirely satisfied the public, nor many who studied the case. For if the death had been sudden, what then of the furnace kept burning for hours? What of the incessant washing? What of the locked doors, the vanished key, and the nervous inquiries about the dissecting vault? What of the scattered remains hidden with such care? Was this the frantic improvisation of a man horrified with what he had done, or did these actions suggest, if not premeditation, then a considerable attempt to conceal a crime? Even at the time, opinion divided sharply. Some saw Webster as a weak man overwhelmed by a moment of fury. Others saw a cooler calculation, the steps of a man who understood precisely what must be hidden. What is certain is that Dr. Parkman's death, however it began, ended in a sequence of actions that ensured Webster's condemnation. And in that tension between impulse and intention lies the enduring complexity of the case. The execution. Professor John Webster met his end on August the 30th, 1850, within the walls of Boston's Leverett Street jail, a place he had once passed without notice, and where he would now complete the final chapter of a scandal that had gripped the nation. The execution was not public. Massachusetts' law required only small appointed company officers of the jail, senior clergy, physicians, and a handful of civic officials. Yet outside the prison gates, a crowd gathered from early morning, eager for news of the moment they were forbidden to witness. Inside, the atmosphere was described as still and strangely reverent. Webster, who had entered the jail 9 months earlier in terror and convulsion, now appeared composed, worn down by confinement, but calm and resigned. In the hours before the execution, he received communion from the Reverend Dr. Putnam, the same clergyman to whom he had made his private confession. He expressed sorrow for what had occurred, sorrow for the suffering inflicted, but he did not contest the jury's judgment. His written confession, prepared earlier, was released only after his death. When the appointed hour arrived, the formalities proceeded with quiet efficiency. There was no dramatic declarations, no last-minute pleas, and those present noted that Webster's subdued bearing, a man who, however he had viewed his guilt, understood that the matter had passed beyond argument. Outside, when the word spread that the drop had fallen, a murmur rippled through the waiting crowd, a mixture of curiosity, melancholy, and the uneasy satisfaction of closure. The body of a Harvard professor had swung from the gallows. It was, in every sense, an extraordinary moment in American legal history. The aftermath proved just as consequential. The Webster Parkman case dramatically advanced public confidence in scientific evidence, particularly the use of dental identification. The plaster cast match presented by Dr. Keep became a celebrated example of scientific certainty in the courtroom, and its influence echoed through forensic practices for decades. And at the same time, the affair stirred uncomfortable debates about class and privilege. That a well-born, well-connected academic could commit so dreadful an act unsettled Victorian assumptions about the moral reliability of respectable men. Harvard itself maintained a careful silence. The reputation would linger far longer than the trial. As for Ephraim Littlefield, the janitor whose persistence had uncovered the truth, he received a substantial reward for his role, nearly $3,000, a sum transformative for a man of his position. Yet the notoriety never entirely left him. He continued his work at Harvard, always competent, always watchful, but marked forever by the part he had played in exposing the crime. The Parkman murder did not simply end with the fall on the gallows. It reshaped expectations of justice, shifted public faith towards forensic science, and left behind a legacy that reached far beyond the walls of the medical college where the tragedy had begun. In the end, the Parkman-Webster affair remains one of those rare Victorian-era cases in which the mystery, the personalities, and the scientific breakthrough are so tightly interwoven that the story feels less like a single event and more like a turning point. A respected doctor vanished on an ordinary November afternoon. A gentleman professor unravelled under pressure he could no longer bear, and a janitor, overlooked, underpaid, and almost entirely invisible within Harvard's hierarchy, became the key to the truth. And in the midst of it all, an emerging science found its moment. What began as a troubling disappearance grew into a scandal that unsettled Boston's highest circles, tested public faith in academic respectability, and ultimately forced the courts to reckon with evidence that no eyewitness, no confession, and no social standing could override: the silent, unarguable testimony of the human teeth. It was this, the match between Dr. Keep's plaster cast and the fragments recovered from the vault, that anchored the prosecution, and that has echoed through every subsequent use of dental identification. Without it, the case might easily have ended in uncertainty. With it, the jury reached a verdict that shaped the future of forensic science. That remains the true legacy of the Parkman murder, a moment when scientific observation spoke louder than social position, louder than fear, and louder than the many shifting stories told in the aftermath. It is a reminder that even in 1849, before fingerprints, before modern pathology, before the techniques we now take for granted, the foundations of forensic investigation were already being laid by men who preserved a cast, observed a fragment, and insisted on fact over assumption. A disappearance, a discovery, and a scientific breakthrough. Together, they form one of the most significant chapters in early forensic history, and a case whose influence can still be felt in the courtrooms of today. Further particulars. In this episode, we veer away from the American type of royalty of the day from Harvard to the outer busy lives of various aristocracy members of Queen Victoria's court. Victorians were deeply exercised over the private lives of other people, particularly if those people happened to possess a title. One correspondent reported with great solemnity on a delicate affair in high life involving a certain Prince George, 2nd Duke of Cambridge and grandson of George III, and a young lady of amiable and popular family who had apparently announced that she was about to become a mother. Her father insisted that the prince do the honourable thing and marry her at once. The prince's father, unsurprisingly, declined. At this point, the situation escalated in a manner particularly Victorian. The young lady's father proposed to apply to Parliament itself to compel the prince to the altar, while another newspaper in high indignant tones claimed that Queen Victoria had already refused to give her consent to the match. The journalist, trying valiantly to restore order, concluded that the entire story was almost certainly nonsense, though not before ensuring that readers had absorbed every detail of the supposed scandal. It is an excellent reminder that while the Victorians gave us telegraphs, anesthesia, and the early foundations of forensic science, they also invested extraordinary energy in speculating about which members of the royal family might be dragged protesting into an unwanted marriage. One seems that the appetite for royal gossip has a very long history indeed. From the Kerry and Munster General Observer, the 4th of November 1842, delicate affair in high life. I purposely refrained last week from referring to the piece of scandal in which the name of His Royal Highness Prince George was mixed up, because I must own I did not attach the least credit to it, being quite aware that nothing is more common than to find persons who are members of the royal family untruly and unjustly accused of vices that they never even contemplated. This was my impression with regard to this affair, involving the dishonour of a most amiable and popular family, and certainly attracting deep disgrace to the prince. The view now with regard to the matter is that the heroine promised to be a mother, that her father insists upon her marriage, that the prince is most willing to espouse the lady, but that his father will not listen to the proposal, and that her Majesty, from whom by Act of Parliament a consent is necessary to make the marriage valid, refuses to give it. One weekly paper that I have seen, the New Bell's Messenger, says that Her Majesty has formally notified her assent, but I am sure it is a mistake. I am positive that in this respect she will out of the principles of her grandfather by never allowing one of the royal family to unite with a British subject. Epilogue. Prince George never married the young woman mentioned in the clipping. That scandal simply evaporated, as Victorian gossip pieces often did. But A few years later, he did secretly marry a woman who would have been considerably thought of as equally unsuitable by the royal family. Sarah Louisa Fairbrother, 1816 to 1890, London actress and dancer, already the mother of several children, some believed to be his, not of royal or aristocratic birth. They married in 1847 without Queen Victoria's permission at a parish church in Clerkenwell under assumed names. But here's the remarkable part. Under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, the marriage had no legal standing. So although he considered Sarah his wife, Sarah could not take the title Duchess of Cambridge, was not acknowledged at court, and was not recognised by Queen Victoria. Prince George lived openly with her, but she remained socially invisible in official circles. Their children were considered illegitimate under the Act. Ah, and that sound, if I'm not mistaken, is our cue. Somewhere in the house, a clock has taken it upon itself to strike an entirely unsolicited hour. The last embers in the grate have performed their final dramatic splutter, and an owl in the garden has just issued a complaint that suggests it would like us all to go to bed. So before the wildlife stages a coup, a gentle reminder that if you enjoyed today's journey into early forensic history, do consider giving the episode a like, subscribing, or sharing it with any fellow enthusiasts of historical crime. It truly helps the channel reach more curious minds. And for the determined Victorian aficionado, you are warmly invited to join us on Patreon, where some 500 additions to this channel's backlog historical documentaries reside, ad-free, neatly organised and unavailable anywhere else. 6 exclusive series, early releases and a monthly Victorian magazine all await you there. For about £5 a month, about 7.5 US dollars. We would be delighted to have you with us. This has been News of the Times, and I am Robin Coles, amateur collector of mislabelled antique teacups, occasional translator of inexplicable marginalia, and enthusiastic but completely unaccredited inspector of squeaky floorboards. Until next time, do take care, and remember, never lend money to anyone who insists on meeting you in a laboratory. Victorian history offers many lessons, but that one is especially durable.